Welcome to the tall ship Kalmar Nyckel. As you probably have already heard, we've recreated one of the original colonizing ships. A ship that founded the new Sweden colony right here in Wilmington, Delaware. And it's okay if you never heard of New Sweden before. Most Americans haven't, even though there are 250,000 or so descendants of the original colonists living in America today. So why not? Well, this colony was exceptional in a whole bunch of ways, and I'll go into that. Now, just to set the setting, of course, in 1492, Columbus tried to find India, and instead he found the Bahamas. And I really like the Bahamas, and that's all I have to say about Columbus. Anyway, over the next 100 years or so, a little more than, European countries began founding trading posts, some of which became colonies, basically all around the world. And there's a whole lot of history there that I'm not going to go into. Well, fast forward then to the 1630s, and King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden gets the idea that, as the great warrior king of Sweden, that he wants an American colony. And then he makes the mistake of leading one too many charges at the Battle of Lutzen and took a bullet through the breastplate. Oh well. He had left orders that his daughter, should anything happen to him, his only child, be raised as you would raise a boy to become the royal person of Sweden. And so Christina, who was 6 years old when Gustavus was killed, was then educated by various scholars that they brought in as her personal tutors, people like René Descartes, who invented analytic geometry. I mean, just minor leaguers, you know what I mean? So they are educating her up. By the time she was 18 and had her coronation, she could speak 6 languages fluently.
Wow.
If you want to go into the history of Christina, she is possibly the most remarkable woman in the 17th century. I'd like to hear who the other candidates are. Anyway, though, I'm not going to spend too much time on her, other than that the river and the hospital and all sorts of things around here are named for her, with good cause. So, fast forward a little bit. Now, up at Manhattan, the Dutch had a colony going. It had originally been up by Albany, but when the third governor arrived, a guy you may have heard of as Peter Minuet, he looked around and said, with this harbor, why are we putting the colony way up there? Let's put it here on this big Manhattan island. And so they began moving the colony. And as part of that, they built a fort. Because, you know, you want a fort, don't you? And Minuit supervised that. Now, I said Minuit. He was from a French-speaking district in what is now Belgium, and was then the Dutch Republic. So he would sign his name Pierre Minuit, so that's what I'm going to call him. Anyway, a little while later, he had an argument with the Dutch West India Company, because that was actually a commercial venture. It wasn't the Dutch Republic conquering this land. They bought the land from the native people. It was a two-way trade that was advantageous to both sides. So he had an argument, though, because some of the richest Dutch patroons that were running the company wanted to have slave plantations on the Hudson, and they wanted to use the local indigenous people as the workers. And Minuit tried to explain to them that that was a very bad idea because there are a few of us and so many of them. He got fired. By the way, his successor, a guy named Kieft, ended up trying to have that war and being driven back to just the area around the fort under the guns of the ships in the harbor. Or they would have wiped the colony out completely. So it turned out Minuit was on the right track. But here he is. He's a colonial governor and he's out of a job. So what would you do? Send your resume into Indeed or one of those things, I guess, or something. But what he did was he had some friends in Sweden. And he went there and he said, now, by this time he'd been in Manhattan for a while. So as I understand it, he said, listen, guys, have I got a deal for you? All right? There's this place, and I've already met the people, and they want to trade with us, and you can set up a colony and make a fortune trading for furs in the New World. Now, if you happen to live in Sweden in the winter, furs are a real good idea. And if you think of the Dutch masters' paintings in the period, it was particularly beaver pelts. Why beaver? You can scrape the fur off and felt it, make a felt cloth out of it, and make that into the big broad-brimmed hats that you see in the Dutch masters' paintings. And Rembrandt did a self-portrait in a beaver hat. Well, what's so exceptional about beaver? First of all, the fur is water repellent. They're beavers, they live in the water. Second, it is very warm in the winter and very cool in the summer because it breathes. So if we were to translate what they were paying for a beaver hat in Amsterdam at the time into modern dollars, it's something on the order of $3,000 to $4,000, depending on how broad the brim is. I use that with school kids to say, you know, imagine if you could buy beaver pelts for $10 a piece and you needed 3 or 4 to make a beaver hat. Would it be worth it at $3,000 or $4,000 a hat to set up a trading post? Usually they figure that out pretty quickly. So anyway, well, they wanted to found a colony, so they got 2 ships. Now, the one ship was a large ship that had been bought from the Dutch, who were the best shipbuilders in the world at the time. They built the Mayflower, they built the Mary Rose, and they built the Sleutel, which was a Dutch word for a key, like a key in a door. The Swedes built a big ship called the Vasa, and they put an extra cannon deck up too high, and they didn't have any marine engineer evaluate whether that was a good idea. The Vasa sank on her maiden voyage as soon as they got all the sails set when they were well out of Stockholm Harbor, with a whole bunch of dignitaries aboard and all. So the king ordered that 4 coastal defense ships be bought, and one of those was the Sleutel. Well, they didn't think that sounded like a very Swedish name, so they renamed it for the city of Kalmar, which was to be its home port and the city it would defend if attacked, and they mounted 12 guns on it. And they called it the Kalmar Nyckel. Now they took the word Sleutel, like a key, and they used the Swedish word. So it's the key to the city of Kalmar. A few years later, they decided to found an expedition. Well, which was the most seaworthy ship they had? And they decided it was the Nyckel. So they started to put together an expedition. They got a smaller boat to go ahead and find the deep water for the bigger ship, so that they wouldn't run aground, which is a very bad thing when you're 3,000 miles from home. And they decided, under the administration of Governor Minuit, that they would leave about the 1st of December. And they sailed out and crossed the North Sea in the middle of December, and they got slammed by a storm and lost the whole bowsprit. The whole front end of the boat got torn off. So they pulled into the little Dutch city of Texel on the coast and refitted. And were trying to explain, without explaining anything, why there were all these supplies aboard and so forth. And, oh, well, we're going to set up a trading post somewhere. They didn't really want to say where they were going because Minuit had surveyed not only the Delaware River but the Christina for the Dutch. So the Dutch sort of figured, even though they'd never made a permanent colony, that it was sort of theirs. And so they sailed down to the Caribbean this is called a bridge, by the way. They sailed down to the Caribbean to get supplies, made their way across, sailed back up, and you would wonder why they would want to sail across the North Sea in December and the North Atlantic in January and February. Well, they arrived here at the rocks in Wilmington at the end of March, and they planted crops. Minuit knew what he was doing. He realized that one of the biggest threats they would face was starvation. No one died at Fort Christina in the first 2 years of the colony. They had high and away the best survival rate of any European colony. So they built a fort almost exactly the same size and type that Minuit had built at Manhattan. He'd learned how. He built more or less the same fort. And they set up a very successful trading with the native people. And you see, there was the problem. The Swedish colony did not fail because of high death rates or wars with the native people. In fact, in this area, including Philadelphia and that whole out to the head of the Chesapeake Bay, there was never a war with the native people. Find that in the other original colonies. And instead, they set up a nice trading business, and their problem was they were too successful. So eventually, Governor Stuyvesant up in Manhattan couldn't stand it anymore, and he sent a letter to the Dutch West India Company that we have, saying, "You got to do something about these Swedes. I can't make a guilder over here. We have canoes of the best furs coming down the Hudson, going right past Manhattan, up the Passaic River, and being portaged 50 miles overland so that they could go down and trade with the Swedes, because they like the Swedes. They never fought a war with the Swedes, and the Swedes are giving it better prices." So the Dutch, now this is fun in modern financial terms. The Dutch chartered 7 ships and hired 500 mercenaries. And the Dutch West India Company did a hostile corporate takeover, keyword is hostile, of the Swedish West India Company. The Dutch Republic was not at war with Sweden, you understand. This was just business. This was a hostile corporate takeover, literally. They laid siege to Fort Christina for a month, and finally the Swedes surrendered honorably in the terms of the day. And so the Dutch said, "Look, we know some of you have to go back to Sweden, your government officials and such. We will take you at our expense because you surrendered honorably and because we don't want a war with Sweden. As to the rest of you, please stay. You really know what you're doing. You've got farms, you've got a whole thriving colony here now, all up and down the river. The native people like you. Stay here, keep doing it. And you can keep the lands you've cleared, you can keep your houses, do it." So most of them did stay. Now, someone that didn't is a man who was taken by the Dutch as a slave in West Africa, and then taken to St. Kitts, where he was made to grow tobacco. And when the first expedition, when the fort was being built here, they sent the smaller ship down to St. Kitts to buy a load of tobacco to make some money for the company. And while they were there, a clever Dutch merchant said, "Well, you need a big bag of tobacco seeds if you're going to make money with this, and you need a man who knows how to grow it." So this man was sold to the Dutch captain who was running the Fogelgrip for the Swedes. I know that's a little complicated, bear with me. Well, the Swedes figured a man ought to have a Christian name, so they named him Anthony for the saint, and Swart, which is simply the Swedish word for black. So he was Anthony Black. I guess that's kind of for obvious reasons. Anyway, he was the first African to become resident in the Delaware Valley. But when he got there, there was a peculiar little problem. Sweden had outlawed slavery in the year 1335, almost 300 years before, because the King of Sweden, Magnus IV, decided that keeping thralls was not a very Christian thing to do, and he was trying to convert the last of the Vikings to Christianity. So here came Anthony Swart, and the Governor Minuit sort of shrugged and said, "Okay, he's a slave." Captain Vanderweer said he's a slave, and the Swedes said, "No, you don't understand. If this is legally Sweden, then he can't be a slave." And so Minuit made what you might call an executive decision, and suddenly in the records, Anthony is an indentured servant, and he works off his 30 guilders purchase price, even though the tobacco that the Dutch had sold him was Caribbean tobacco and it wouldn't grow here. Clever salesman there. So anyway, Anthony stayed here. We don't have a lot of information about him, but we know from the records that he bought out his purchase price. We know that he became the man because he was so good with small boats. He'd been a fisherman in West Africa. He became the man in charge of the governor's launch, taking the governor all up and down the colony, because oddly enough, there was no I-95. So they would travel all around, and when the winds were foul, he would have 6 Swedes pulling oars for him. Then, when the Dutch finally came down and took over, Anthony disappeared from the records. He had a license to trade with the Lenape, and the Lenape story is that he was taken in by those people. There are people in Wilmington in Southbridge who are descended, they claim, from Anthony Swarm. There's nothing in the historical record that disproves that. So, there you have a quick history. Now, as we go under the bridge here, we're going to go past Fort Christina Park over on this side, and you can see the monument that the Swedes gave for the 300th anniversary, Carl Millis, the sculptor, and they built the park just to get that monument put here instead of in Philadelphia, because the Delaware delegation couldn't stand the thought of that monument being in Philadelphia. So now we have the modern Kalmar Nyckel. The keel was laid in 1995 because descendants of the original settlers got the idea, if you want to tell the story, build the ship. And we've recreated it as well as accurately as we can, staying within Coast Guard regulations. She's a modern ship in modern waters. So yeah, we have modern electronic navigation. If any of you would like to join the crew or know somebody who wants to run off to sea and say arg a lot, everybody in a blue shirt or a teal shirt is a volunteer crewman like me, and we'd be happy to tell you what's involved, or you can send them to Google Tall Ship of Delaware. Go to the website and you'll get it.